Good morning, our viewers. Welcome to Council for Strategic Affairs Roundtable discussion. Today is Saturday, April 13th, 2024. And those of you who registered probably saw our brochure with all our distinguished panelists. The topic for today's roundtable discussion is roadblocks to the FMCT. FMCT stands for Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. We are very happy at the Council for Strategic Affairs to hold this important roundtable discussion. We have 4 distinguished panelists, and the panel is very diverse and very much balanced. Our first panelist is Daryl Kimball, who is the Executive Director of Arms Control Association. Second panelist is Sanjana Gogna, who is a Kelleher Fellow at University of Maryland Public Policy School. Professor Yoichiro Sato from Reshmi, Asia Pacific University. And Professor Reshmi Kazi from Nelson Mandela Center for Peace Studies from Jamia Milia Islamia University. A little bit about Council for Strategic Affairs. The Council imparts education in the field of international relations. CSA fosters discussion, dialogue, and debate on geopolitical issues. We encourage strategic studies in general to raise the level of awareness. We condemn terrorism in all its forms worldwide. The CSA aims to contribute towards world peace and prosperity, and we do promote people-to-people contacts and track to diplomacy. We have a monthly roundtable discussion on second Saturday of each month at 10 AM Eastern Daytime, like we are having today. We have a monthly guest lecture by a domain expert, usually on third or fourth Saturday of each month at the same time. There's a one-on-one interview feature, strategically speaking, with Dr. Adityanjee. We do organize symposia, meetings, and conferences. We promote publication of articles on geopolitics and related subjects. We have a summer internship program for college students and a fellowship training program in strategic studies. So you are seeing the picture of our first distinguished panelist, Mr. Daryl Kimball. Daryl Kimball is the Executive Director of the Arms Control Association. He is the publisher and contributor for the organization's monthly journal, Arms Control Today, since September of 2001. From 1997 to 2001, he was the Executive Director of the Coalition to Reduce Nuclear Dangers, a consortium of 17 of the largest US non-governmental organizations working together to strengthen national and international security by reducing the threats posed by nuclear weapons. From 1989 to 1997, Daryl worked as Associate Director for the Policy and later the Director of Security Programs for Physicians for Social Responsibility, where he organized media, lobbying, and public education campaigns against nuclear weapons, production and testing, and research projects on health and environmental impacts of nuclear arms race. Daryl Kimball was former Herbert R. Scoville Peace Fellow in 1989. He's a graduate of Miami University of Ohio from 1986, where he received a BA in Political Science and Diplomacy and Foreign Affairs, and was the recipient of the Ohio Governor's Youth Award for Peace. He was born and raised in Oxford, Ohio, which is a college town, where his father was also professor at the Miami University. This is the picture of Sanjana Gogna. Sanjana Gogna is a PhD scholar and a Kelleher Fellow at School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Her research mainly focuses on nuclear weapons strategy and deterrence theory, Prior to starting her doctoral studies, Sanjana was a research associate at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, where she authored a paper on nuclear multipolarity with specific emphasis on South Asia region. Sanjana has also worked at the Center for Air Power Studies, or CAPS, a think tank associated with Indian Air Force, where she wrote a monograph titled An Indian Perspective on China's Nuclear Weapons. Sanjana received her bachelor's and master's degrees in political science from University of Delhi. She also holds a master's degree in non-proliferation and terrorism studies from Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, California. While at Monterey, Ms. Gogna worked as a research assistant at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies and was part of studies on nuclear security involving the U.S., China, and India. Our third panelist is joining from Japan, Professor Yoichiro Sato, and it is 11 p.m. in Japan, so it's late in the evening. Professor Sato holds a BA in law from Keio University in Japan and MA in international studies from University of South Carolina and a PhD in political science from University of Hawaii. And currently he is professor and dean at Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University. Previously, he has also taught at the U.S. Department of Defense's Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies and at Auckland University in New Zealand. He has been a visiting professor at multiple institutions. His more than 10 published books include the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance, Regional Institutions, Geopolitics and Economics in the Asia Pacific, and Re-Rising Japan. His commentaries have appeared in various global media, including Time, Newsweek, Al Jazeera, AFP, and Nikkei, Asian Review. And I'm very proud to say that he has been on the CSA platform several times. And lastly, Professor Reshmi Kazi. Professor Kazi is professor at the Nelson Mandela Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution at Jamia University in New Delhi. She was associate fellow at the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis in New Delhi. Her expertise areas include India's nuclear weapon policy, nuclear non-proliferation studies, nuclear security, nuclear terrorism, and global nuclear disarmament. She follows other issues related to bioterrorism and chemical terrorism and has written and published on these issues. She has a doctorate degree from Disarmament Division Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament from School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. Her doctoral thesis was on evolution of India's nuclear doctrine. She has earlier worked as research fellow in the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies in New Delhi. She has written extensively and has been published very heavily. And again, I'm proud to say this is not her first time on CSA platform. She has been in our platform in various capacities for distinguished lectures as well as for roundtable discussions. So the topic is Roadblocks to FMCT, Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. It was proposed to be an international agreement that would prohibit the production of the two main components of nuclear weapons, mainly highly enriched uranium and plutonium. Discussions on this subject have taken place at UN Conference on Disarmament, a body of 65 member nations established as the sole multilateral negotiating forum on disarmament. The CD operates by consensus and is very slow, so the progress on FMCT has not been really great. Those nations that join the NPT as non-weapon states are already prohibited from producing or acquiring fissile materials for weapons. And FMCT would provide new restrictions for 5 recognized nuclear weapon states that everyone knows, and 4 non-NPT nuclear weapon states that are Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. I will not speak much and leave everything for our distinguished panelists, but a couple of housekeeping rules. Please mute yourself to avoid noise interference. Please change your cell phone settings to vibration modes. Please do not try to interrupt our esteemed panelists when they are speaking. Only those members of the audience who identify themselves openly will be allowed to ask questions. No anonymous questioners, please. All questions are moderated by the chat room. Questions have to be sent to the chat room. Please be precise and specific in asking a question. Don't send detailed comments in the form of a monologue. We are recording this program. It will be available on our YouTube channel and on our website. And it is also being simultaneously live streamed on our YouTube channel. So without further ado, I will start inviting our distinguished panelists. Each panelist will make an opening statement for 7 minutes. This will be followed by a moderated discussion. And finally, if we have some time, we will entertain questions from our audience. And the first panelist who will start this roundtable discussion is Daryl Kimball. Daryl, welcome to the CSA platform. The floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation to speak about the impasse, the obstacles on negotiating the fissile material cutoff treaty. And I want to start by just noting that last month there was a special meeting at the UN Security Council on disarmament issues that was convened by Japan, and it highlighted the fact that the risk of nuclear arms racing and nuclear war is higher than at any point since the end of the Cold War. And it also highlighted what some of the differences are between the nuclear armed states about reducing the nuclear danger. And to describe the problem, the Japanese foreign minister warned that the world now stands on the cusp of reversing decades of declines in nuclear stockpiles. And clearly a part of that effort for many decades has been to seek a verifiable halt on the production of fissile material, as you said, highly enriched uranium and plutonium. And Japan announced at the UN Security Council meeting last month that it would form a Friends of the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty to try to jumpstart the long-delayed effort to negotiate such an agreement at the Conference on Disarmament. And the UN Secretary General also called for reforms at the Conference on Disarmament to open the way for long-delayed talks on the FMCT. He also suggested the need to negotiate legally binding negative security assurances against nuclear attack from the for the non-nuclear weapon states, which is a priority for many of them. Now, just to put some of the FMCT issues in perspective, we need to keep in mind that roughly 99% of the world's highly enriched uranium stocks are owned by the recognized nuclear weapon states. Russia, the United States have the largest stocks. India, Pakistan, and North Korea are believed to have ongoing production operations for HEU. About 88% of the plutonium in the world is held by states that are nuclear weapons treaty signatories, mainly the 5 nuclear weapon states. 12%, however, is held by Japan, which has some 47 tons of so-called civilian plutonium under IAEA safeguards. And although the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states have declared or are believed to no longer be producing weapons-grade plutonium, production continues in India, Israel, North Korea, and Pakistan. Now, what has been well known for some time is that in order for negotiations to begin on an FMCT in Geneva at the Conference on Disarmament, one of the key elements would be for Pakistan to remove its opposition to a consensus decision to move forward on negotiations under the so-called Shannon mandate for the scope of the treaty that was negotiated back in the 90s. China also has concerns about an FMCT because it may want to produce more fissile material to build up the size of its arsenal, which is large, but it is just a fraction of the size of the nuclear arsenals of the United States and Russia. Pakistan has primarily been concerned that the FMCT, a production halt without restrictions on existing stockpiles, would lock Pakistan into a disadvantageous position relative to India's larger nuclear and fissile material stockpile. And so Islamabad's opposition has been mainly based upon that concern. And to advance progress on disarmament talks and other key issues at the CD, it's important to note that the United States just earlier this year in February said that it would drop its opposition to negotiations on legally binding assurances against nuclear attack for non-nuclear weapon states in good standing with the NPT if other states, particularly China and Pakistan, were to drop their objections to long-delayed talks on the FMCT. So this kind of quid pro quo, if accepted by Beijing, could jumpstart CD activity, Conference on Disarmament activity, and lead to some tangible results and negotiations on these key issues. Now, at that Security Council meeting I mentioned, China's delegate agreed that the risk of a nuclear arms race and a nuclear conflict is rising. He invited other nuclear armed states to explore the possibility of a joint no first use agreement. Only China and India have declared no first use of nuclear weapons policies, but the Chinese ambassador made no mention of the FMCT at that recent Security Council meeting. Now, China's proposal on a no first use agreement is designed, of course, to highlight its longstanding policy on no first use, perhaps divert attention from China's nuclear buildup. Nevertheless, in our view, such an agreement would help reduce nuclear risks. And it's something that the United States should seriously consider and engage with China and Russia and France and the UK on. And I think that would help encourage China to more seriously consider the United States proposal for the start of talks on an FMCT at the Conference on Disarmament. And the United States could also make it clear that the United States does not threaten nuclear coercion against China, which I think could assuage China's concerns and lead to a much more conducive atmosphere for negotiations bilaterally and at the Conference on Disarmament. So all of these steps, and there are some other ones that I haven't mentioned that were discussed at the Security Council meeting, including a new nuclear arms reduction framework between the U.S. and Russia before the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty expires in 2026, are vital to international peace and security. And all of the nuclear armed member states of the NPT are obligated under Article 6 of that treaty to engage in good faith negotiations to halt the arms race and move towards disarmament. And the FMCT is one of several key elements that are part of that obligation under the non-proliferation treaty. And of course, it's also, in my view, in the interest of India and Pakistan to reconsider their old positions on nuclear disarmament issues, ranging from the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty with respect to India to the FMCT with respect to Pakistan, so that they are part of the solution rather than part of this the problem facing the world with respect to the rising risk of nuclear war and nuclear arms racing. So let me stop there. I'm looking forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say and the questions in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Daryl, for a very comprehensive opening statement and sticking to the timeline of 7 minutes. I really appreciate that. That's one good thing I look into the panelists, if they will stick to the timeline. My second panelist who will take floor is Sanjana Gogna. So Sanjana, please, your chance, take the platform. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Dr. Adityanjee, for your kind introduction. And thank you, Mr. Kimball, for the wonderful opening remarks. Before I dive into why Pakistan has torpedoed talks on FMCT at the Conference on Disarmament, I want to talk about the basic principles of deterrence and cooperation that are central to arms control. Both deterrence, that is the ability to cause an adversary to resist an attack, and cooperation is a lot easier to achieve when there's a parity between both sides, meaning both the sides have a roughly similar power variable. That includes just not the number of warheads, but delivery systems, conventional capabilities, the size of the army and the economy, normative power, and so on. When two powers believe that they're equal, they're a lot willing to cooperate on the matters of arms control and verification. So a good example is US and the Soviet Union or Russia over the years. And a not so good example is the efforts to pull China into the New START Treaty. Now, with that being said, Pakistan's said reasons for not letting the talks happen is its lack of parity with regards to India's nuclear stockpile. Now, that seems plausible, but let's separate the layers and look at the numbers. According to recent assessments, Pakistan possesses about 110 to 120 warheads. India, on the other hand, possesses about 90 to 110. So there's a parity there, with Islamabad, in fact, slightly in the lead. Coming to fissile materials, which is a material that you need to make bombs, Pakistan is known to possess about 2,000 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, which can allow it to produce about 100 simple warheads. It can develop additional 90 warheads with the plutonium that it can produce at the Chashma reactors that it has built with the help of the Chinese. So in its current position, Pakistan has a potential to produce about 190 warheads in total. India is known to have material to produce about 140 warheads. So again, there is almost a parity with Pakistan in the lead. A lot of people in Pakistan have argued that India can still have a more potential to build warheads because it's a member of the nuclear suppliers group, so it can import uranium and then enrich it and then siphon it to make weapons. Some in Pakistan have also argued that India uses these fast breeder reactors, so it can make weapon-grade plutonium. But if India is importing uranium, it's going to be monitored because it's only going to be used for the civilian facilities. And fast breeder reactors don't really have a long, lifeline. And France has used it before, and they have a tendency to break down. They have very long repair time. So there's a good chance that India would stop using them. So is lack of parity really the reason? At many instances, Pakistan has tried to use FMCT as a bargaining chip, where in exchange for the talks on FMCT, it expects to receive a nuclear deal, like India did. A nuclear deal would mean lifting of the international restrictions by the nuclear suppliers group. So holding up the treaty might allow Pakistan to keep up the prospect of a better bargain. Second, Pakistan often uses a strategy of ambiguity. We see it in its brinkmanship and its counterforce strategies. So while its nuclear weapons program is founded on the notion of credible minimum deterrence, that is to keep the number of weapons as small as possible to cause massive destruction, it keeps a minimum threshold vague to leverage some deterrence advantage. If Pakistan is obliged by the treaty, it may have to declare its stockpile numbers, which may not be in its strategic interests. The third reason is to do with the security dilemma. The Indo-US nuclear deal elevated Pakistan's threat perceptions in many ways. Following the deal, New Delhi and Washington agreed to cooperate on civilian space programs, high technology trade, missile defense, and civilian nuclear activities. Further, as India develops advanced nuclear capabilities, such as MIRVs, which we recently tested, or the SSBNs, which is the nuclear submarines, mainly to counter China, Pakistan might want to keep its options open in case it needs to build more warheads in future to keep up with India. Finally, holding up the deal does not carry a lot of consequences for Pakistan. The United States or any of the P5 members haven't put a lot of pressure on Pakistan either. FMCT has just not been high on the agenda of any of the permanent members. So the reasons for Pakistan to torpedo FMCT is not limited to its perceived stockpile disparity with India, but could also be a function of its larger security dilemma, its ambiguous posturing, and prospects for a better future bargain. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sanjana, for your opening statement. Again, I thank you for keeping within the time limit. Now it's my honor and pleasure to invite Professor Sato Yoichiro to give his opening statement. Professor Sato, please take the platform.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, Dr. Adityanjee. It's a very pleasure to join this very distinguished panel of experts. Japan has been forefront of many of the anti-nuclear initiatives, and that's precisely because of Japan's experience as the victims of the nuclear weapons during the World War II, and throughout the post-war period, the anti-nuclear movements in Japan have had very strong political support. So not only the opposition parties, but the ruling Liberal Democratic Party politicians have undertaken efforts to promote global nuclear disarmament of the various agreements. The Prime Minister Kishida, in particular, is very committed to the nuclear issues because of his the electoral basis in the city of Hiroshima. So Kishida has been speaking on these issues from time to time, and his foreign minister Kamikawa is also very much supportive of the Prime Minister's commitment to nuclear disarmament. For Japan, it's not only about this historically based ideology of anti-nuclear, but also the nuclear development in its immediate neighborhood is concerned. And most importantly, North Korean nuclear development since became well known since the beginning of the 1990s. Continues to remain unsolved. And Japan has taken part in the six-party talk on North Korea's nuclear disarmament and other related issues on the Korean Peninsula. But since North Korea walked out of that negotiation, very little has happened except the bilateral summitry attempts by U.S. President Donald Trump. Japan has been looking for an opportunity to get back into discussion of North Korean nuclear weapons, but so far, what forum will address this issue remains quite unknown. That's because the six-party talk shows no signs of getting resurrected, and the U.S. Electoral prospects, especially that of Donald Trump's return to power, makes it very uncertain whether the U.S. will ever rejoin the multilateral effort to address North Korea's nuclear weapons. So that's one of the major concerns. And the other concern, of course, Japan is a key ally of the United States and also European countries. And by default of that, Japan is concerned about Iran's nuclear enrichment. The uranium enrichment by Iran has been an issue since the Bush administration started addressing this issue, and Japan has been in consultation with the United States on this issue. But Japan's unique stance in the Middle East, which is very much even-handed among all of the disputing parties in the region between Iran and Arab states, Gulf states, and between Israel and Arab states, Gulf states. Japan has kept kind of all-directional, omnidirectional diplomacy in the region. That's largely because Japan's heavy reliance on oil imports from all of the major producers. Having said that, however, Japan hopes that Iran will return to this the multilateral agreement to control the put its the the uranium enrichment under the IAEA inspections and abide by the regulation to keep the enrichment level lower. So that's on Iran. And with the nuclear arms development by India and Pakistan, Japan initially took a very strong response when the two countries tested nuclear weapons in the late 1990s and placed even-handed sanction against both of them. However, Japan's relationship with India has advanced quite rapidly in the later years. And with that, Japan joined the United States to relax its sanction against India. And then eventually Japan decided to welcome India into this the nuclear supplier group so that India's the civilian nuclear reactors can be put under better inspection. With Pakistan's nuclear weapons, Japan has concurrently dropped the strong languages, but in terms of actual status of Pakistan on the nuclear issues, Japan has made no change. So the Pakistan's nuclear weapons are not recognized by Japan. Pakistan is not recognized as a nuclear weapon state, and the Pakistan's the enrichment activities are not endorsed by Japan. So with all of that, Japan maintains kind of compromised position on the nuclear proliferations. However, Japan has not given up the basic principles toward the global nuclear disarmament. And the last thing I would like to mention is Japan's own the nuclear material, which Dr. Kimball earlier mentioned. Japan is not a nuclear weapon state, but Japan has a large stockpile of nuclear material, and Japan does have nuclear enrichment technology because Japan has developed a capability for reprocessing the used plutonium. So this was done because Japan's heavily reliant on exported energy resources, and nuclear energy has been identified from very early on as one of the key pillars of energy supply for the country. And with that, the nuclear power plants have been built throughout the nation. and they remained fully operational until the Fukushima accident in 2011. And the nuclear power plants have been reopened since then, and they're going through resumption of power generation. However, many of Japan's reactors are aging, and replacing them with new ones would be a very political challenging thing to do. So quite likely Japan will gradually phase out of nuclear power generations as it stands now in terms of the technology. And unless there is new type of nuclear power which doesn't cause the same level of concerns as the power plants today, it's quite likely that Japan will not increase nuclear power generation in the coming years. So what to do with those stockpile of nuclear material? Well, Japan has returned some to the United States. That is plutonium Japan received from the United States back in the 1970s, I believe, when Japan was starting the major nuclear power generations. But still, Japan is a large holder of nuclear material. But the good thing is it's under full inspection. Unlike the case of North Korea has temporarily suspended plutonium enrichment under the framework agreement back in the 1990s. The agreed framework, sorry, have to be accurate on that. But there are several unknowns as far as North Korea is concerned. Nobody knows how much plutonium North Korea has hidden before the agreed framework. And nobody knows how much uranium enrichment North Korea has done in the past. And nobody knows how much of the plutonium North Korea has converted into weapons. And then nobody knows whether North Korea has processed additional enriched plutonium since North Korea kicked out the IAEA observers from its the enrichment plant in Yongbyon. So with all that uncertainty, plus North Korea's development of newer type of delivery methods, most recently including the submarine with the vertical the launching system. North Korea is developing the cruise missile technology and some other possibly also hypersonic the projectiles as well. So Japan's very concerned about this development. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Sato. Now we have the fourth panelist, Professor Reshmi Kazi. And Professor Reshmi Kazi will give her opening statement. Professor Kazi, please.
Thank you, Dr. Adityanjee. And of course, thanks to Council for Strategic Affairs for having me here again. It's a privilege. Please accept my gratitude. To begin with, I mean, being the last, speaker, the disadvantages, everything has been spoken. But I would, just to add to it, I would rather highlight India's position. Probably, I can add to the debate, to the discussion here. by raising the Indian standpoint on the FMCT. But to begin with, we must appreciate that the importance of FMCT, it has been emphasized, it has been reiterated for decades now by states, both nuclear weapon states as well as non-nuclear weapon states. And India is not excluded from this mix. Why? Essentially because India attaches priority to nuclear disarmament, and it of course supports the negotiation in the CD for a universal, non-discriminatory, and internationally verifiable fissile material cutoff treaty. One, of course, that meets India's national security interest. Being a nuclear weapon capable state and a responsible member of the international community, India, of course, shares a commitment to working towards a world wherein, as poignantly put forth by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, that mankind do not have to live under the suicidal shadow of nuclear war and the risk of nuclear conflict, where there will be no arms race and ultimately a total elimination without nuclear weapons can be globally achieved. We can look forward to that. We can hope for it. In that backdrop, during the thematic debate on prevention of nuclear war, including all related matters on FMCT that was held on March 12, 2024, our Indian representative, Ambassador Anupam Ray, emphasized India's support for negotiation in the CD for a universal, non-discriminatory, and internationally verifiable FMCT. Of course, one that meets India's national security interest. Now, this is, of course, it's consistent with India's interest, and towards that end, India has made efforts towards strengthening. It makes efforts towards strengthening the global non-proliferation regime. One, of course, that would, as emphasized by our Ambassador Ray, it would provide a degree of strategic predictability, as well as it will also provide an effective platform for future global nuclear disarmament efforts. While there exist contentious issues related to the FMCT negotiations, particularly on the scope related to pre-existing as well as future stocks, India appreciates that FMCT is an important tool to prevent the world from edging on the brink of any nuclear catastrophe. And to that extent, it's an effective measure, it's an effective tool to cap the quantitative aspects of a nuclear arms race. So, FMCT is an important measure of arms control, which, as we all understand, and we know that it is steadily corroding at present. India strongly believes that FMCT can be a significant contribution to this already eroding non-proliferation regime, and to that extent, if realized, of course, to the conditions, subject to the conditions that India also has, it can prevent erosion of this non-proliferation regime. India supports the mandate for the proposed FMCT, which was, of course, explicitly reflected in the resolution and confirmed in the Shannon mandate in CD 1299. That was, of course, to negotiate a non-discriminatory, multilateral, and internationally and effectively verifiable treaty that bans the production of fissile material for nuclear weapons and other nuclear explosive devices. India also emphasized that FMCT must be universally applicable to all states. And to that extent, it must not be and should not be a regional arms control measure. This is also important because so that the scope of the FMCT could provide a high level of assurance that there is no cheating and there is no violation of this important arms control measure. And to that extent, India supports the mandate of the proposed FMCT and this was reaffirmed by the CD in 1998. India's position was reaffirmed in 1998. And then again in 2009 in its consensus decisions as far as the Conference on Disarmament was concerned. And as India reiterated that, therein we reiterated that we do not favor reopening this mandate, which essentially offers the best prospects for commencement of the FMCT negotiations in the CD. I must make an observation here that India's acceptance of participation in the negotiation, though under conditions, it only reflects India is prepared in the event that FMCT materializes or it emerges, that and meets the proposed conditions, that India is ready to join the FMCT. We all understand and we are aware that arms control is eroding, but FMCT, if it's to materialize, subject to India's interest, national interest, it can create confidence, and in the face of lack of trust, geopolitical tensions, gross mistrust that is evident, which has escalated the risk of nuclear warfare to the highest point in the contemporary times. We all know that the doomsday clock is also ticking loudly, and we can all hear that. And as emphasized by our own Prime Minister Narendra Modi, that today's era is not that of war, and that here we must give diplomacy and dialogue primacy in the best interest of reducing the risk of nuclear war. And I think FMCT can be an effective measure to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Kazi, for your opening statement. Now we have some moderated discussion, and I will start with a question to Daryl Kimball. Daryl, we have talked about, the obligations for not producing fissile material by non-nuclear weapon states, and Article 6 of NPT for nuclear weapon states. In your opinion, the situation of Iran, which is ostensibly a non-nuclear weapon state, but continues to do enrichment almost to the tune of 60% enrichment, developing stockpiles. What does it do to the concept of a universally verifiable FMCT? Daryl?
Sure. Well, what I would say first of all is that Iran does not have nuclear weapons. It says it does not have a nuclear weapons program, but it's pretty well known that Iran has experimented with concepts that could help them produce nuclear weapons if Iran produces fissile material. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, was very successful in curtailing Iran's potential to produce weapons-grade material. It improved the access of inspectors beyond the standard comprehensive safeguards arrangements that non-nuclear weapon states have. But the Trump administration's decision to unilaterally pull out of the JCPOA has created an extremely chaotic situation that we're now facing. So Iran potentially can produce a significant quantity of highly enriched uranium that is about 25 kilograms of HEU within 3 to 5 to 6 weeks if uninterrupted and undetected. Now, does that make, and when I say HEU, I'm talking about 90% enriched uranium, not necessarily 60%. 90% is considered weapons grade. So Iran is on the cusp of being able to produce enough material for one bomb. Is a verifiable global fissile material cutoff treaty negotiated at the Conference on Disarmament or some other venue the solution to the Iranian nuclear puzzle? I would say no, that is not the most direct and effective way. The most effective way is for the United States, the other members of the P5, the European Union, to find a way back to the negotiating table with the Iranians to effect mutual restraint measures, not necessarily in a new formal agreement, but new restraint measures that move Iran further back from the point at which they can produce weapons-grade material quickly, and that, just as importantly, improves the amount of IAEA access to Iran's declared and undeclared facilities, so that we, the international community, can know if Iran is, racing to try to produce material for nuclear weapons. So this is in short, this is a problem that's not going to be solved through an FMCT, because this is a near-term and urgent proliferation problem.
Thank you, Daryl. My next question goes to Sanjana Gogna. Sanjana, while talking about Pakistan's opposition to FMCT, you mentioned that Pakistan's nuclear program is actually based on the concept of minimal credible deterrence. But there has been a revision in Pakistan's program doctrine. They no longer talk about credible minimal deterrence. They are talking about what is called by General Rashid Kidwai, the former director of the Strategic Planning Division of Pakistan's nuclear program, is full spectrum deterrence. So Pakistan has modified and made its nuclear postures much more aggressive in at least last decade. Any comments on that?
Thank you, Dr. Adityanjee. It's a very good question, and that's true. Pakistan has moved towards a full spectrum deterrence with the introduction of its tactical, tactical weapons, which is the Nasser system. But credible minimum deterrence and full spectrum deterrence are two very different things. You can still have a full spectrum deterrence with a minimum deterrence, because full spectrum deterrence means having nuclear weapons to deter conventional, aggression as well as a nuclear war. So by the means of tactical nuclear weapons, they try to introduce nuclear weapons into the conventional warfare. So they can still have less number of weapons, and the reason they keep the numbers low is for a variety of reasons, because they probably don't have enough material or enough money. And I think there is a larger understanding that with the minimum warheads, they can still pose massive destruction towards India. So there's really no need to reach to the level of the warheads that US or China have. So it can still manage to deter India with a minimum deterrence, and full spectrum deterrence is also manageable with low numbers of warhead.
Okay. Thank you, Sanjana, for clarification. My next question goes to Professor Sato. Professor Sato, you talked about the postures of North Korea, Iran, as well as China. Now, Mr. Kimball, in his opening statement, mentioned that the 5 nuclear weapon states have already ceased the production of HEU and plutonium. And that is allegedly said about China. But China has never publicly confirmed or verified that it has ceased the production of either of those two. And China has been very vociferous opponent of FMCT. What are your comments on Chinese postures?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I don't believe that China is satisfied with the status quo of its possession of the weapon-grade nuclear material. I believe China is seeking improved parity vis-a-vis other major nuclear players, mostly the United States, but to some degree also Russia is a potential rival of China. And the current discussion about the necessity to bring China into the comprehensive nuclear weapons control is not going anywhere, because China is not willing to join such a disarmament initiative until China reaches a better parity against the major powers. So a lot of Japan's defense, which is done in the name of North Korean threat, is actually directly applicable to China as well. And take a look at the missile defense. When the missile defense was initially introduced to Japan, the government was officially talking about this is a system to meet the nuclear weapons threat from a rogue state. And basically, it was supposed to be a system which would try to shoot down 1 or 2 incoming missiles from North Korea. But today, the discussion has shifted, and Japan is talking about the massive missile strikes coming from China and Japan's inability to defend its bases. So much so that the discussion has shifted from pure defense to Japan's possession of offensive strike capability. And Japan doesn't have a first strike doctrine, so any kind of the use of long range offensive capability is termed as a counter strike capability. But Japan has already agreed with the United States to procure the Tomahawk missiles, and Japan is also upgrading its own the ground-based missiles so that they will have a longer range and can be launched from the Aegis destroyers Japan possess. So with all that, the missile arms race is already starting, and that's pretty much in response to this China's attitude of reluctance to join any kind of arms control regime.
Thank you, Professor Sato. My next question goes to Professor Kazi. Professor Kazi, we are primarily discussing roadblocks to the FMCT. And as various panelists have talked about, most of the roadblocks are being erected by 2 states. One of them is Pakistan, and second is China. None of the distinguished panelists today have talked about Israel's opposition to FMCT. Can you elaborate a little bit, Professor Kazi, on Israel's opposition to FMCT?
Thank you, Dr. Adityanjee, for that question. Excellent question. Israel's position on FMCT, they have, in any case, Israel's position has been quite ambiguous as far as its nuclear posture is concerned. But of late, the FOPA or whatever you can say, Israel's minister, when he highlighted a nuclear option as an option, possible option as far as Gaza is concerned, that created a lot of controversy, and it was, of course, condemned. And that essentially brings forth a lot of things on the table. The very fact that Israel is thinking, or at the governmental level, this kind of view is there about a nuclear war, and at a time when we know that the world is on the edge of a nuclear catastrophe, we are in fact moving towards it with the state of affairs. It's important that Israel comes more clear and on the FMCT issue. and as herein is it's a good opportunity. It's an effective measure where we know that the non-proliferation regime can be strengthened, and I think Israel should take like the best opportunity of that and come more forthright, more clear, and of course more supportive than what it is right now. I mean, right now its opposition is very clear, but it should be more supportive of the FMCT in the interest of arms control and the non-proliferation regime.
Daryl, do you have any opinion about Israel's postures about FMCT?
Well, I mean, first of all, let's point out the fact that Israel has around 100 nuclear weapons. It does not acknowledge that it has nuclear weapons officially, but this is one of the worst secrets of the nuclear age. But I would say that Israel is not at the moment the diplomatic impediment to the negotiation of an FMCT. They have not raised their card, so to speak, to block consensus at the Conference on Disarmament. That may come if those negotiations get going, but I would just point out that Israel has is the only country in the Middle East region that has nuclear weapons. It should be in Israel's national interest to exercise restraint with respect to fissile material production. It has a plutonium production reactor at its Dimona reactor because it's in its interest not to allow other countries in the region to acquire nuclear weapons capabilities. It's in Israel's interest to sign and ratify the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty because it has an interest in making sure that other countries don't have that option and that the international community can better detect and deter nuclear test explosions. But the main problem is the fact that Israel does not acknowledge its nuclear weapons program, which is, I think, detrimental and corrosive to what is left of Israel's democracy. You can't have a true democracy if you can't debate public policy about national security issues, and Israel's nuclear weapons are certainly a part of the national security equation for the Israeli citizens. And then secondly, the United States, I think, has, as Israel's strongest ally, has a responsibility to press Israel more strongly to become a part of the solution for nuclear restraint in the Middle East. But that, unfortunately, is not something that is likely to happen. If I could just add one other thought about China that came up in the discussion before. As Dr. Sato says, Japan's approach to nuclear disarmament and its efforts to reinforce its conventional deterrence is certainly driven by concerns about both North Korea and China. But in order for China to become a part of the nuclear disarmament enterprise, I think we need to consider that China has a different set of concerns, its own set of concerns about ensuring its nuclear retaliatory potential in relation to the United States and a potential conflict over Taiwan or the Taiwan Straits. China is widely believed to be building up its strategic nuclear arsenal. It probably has somewhere between 400 and 500 nuclear weapons total. Maybe half of those are on long-range strategic systems. The idea that Russia, China, and the United States are going to sit down at one table and negotiate an arms control is not a viable idea, even though at one point the Trump administration suggested it was. What the United States is pursuing and should pursue is a bilateral dialogue with China to reduce nuclear risks, to develop risk reduction initiatives like joint missile flight test notifications to discuss what each side's respective nuclear postures and nuclear weapons use policies are. And in my view, what the United States and China and states outside of non-nuclear weapon states should be encouraging is for the United States and Russia to immediately engage in talks on maintaining restraints on their much larger strategic arsenals before New START expires in February of 2026, and for other nuclear armed states, particularly China, to exercise restraint with respect to the size of their arsenals. So, in other words, a Chinese nuclear freeze regime in exchange for further progress in U.S. and Russian strategic nuclear arms control and reductions. Now, that's a very bold idea, but it is one that I think many countries outside of the nuclear nine, let's call them, really need to be talking about as a more equitable and balanced approach.
Daryl, coming back to Professor Sato's, understanding of China's postures, talking to some of the Chinese delegates in Carnegie International Conference for Non-Proliferation, I have had at private level talked to some of the Chinese delegates, and their position is very clear. They will not say it openly that China will not participate in any arms control international regime till they achieve parity with the United States. So whatever their rhetoric is officially for non-proliferation, for arms control, is just for public consumption. Their main idea is to achieve parity with the United States. That they say that openly in private conversations, but there is a deception going on here, public postures versus private conversations.
Well, I don't agree that is China's goal. When you say parity with the United States and Russia, I mean, we have to keep in mind the United States and Russia have roughly 5,000 nuclear weapons, not all of which are deployed. Some of these are retired and awaiting dismantlement, but there are 5,000 nuclear weapons total. At this moment, the United States and Russia have about 1,700 to 1,800 nuclear weapons that could be delivered within minutes, hours, or days against one another somewhere else. China has a smaller but still deadly force of some 200 to 350 warheads on long-range systems. So when we talk about parity, it is not apparent in private conversations or public statements to me that China is trying to achieve numerical parity. They may be trying to make sure that if a nuclear conflict erupts between the U.S. and China over the Taiwan Straits or some other issue, they have the ability to strike back against the U.S. and therefore to deter the U.S. from using nuclear weapons in any such conflict. And they're concerned that U.S. conventional nuclear capabilities could negate a good part of their arsenal. So that's why they're building up their ICBM capabilities in Western China. Now, I'm not justifying that, but I think that is the motivation. And the idea of parity with respect to nuclear weapons is, I think, something of an illusion. China has for years, for instance, had maybe 100 long-range warheads on long-range systems, whereas the United States and the Soviet Union once had tens of thousands. So for China, for many years, that was sufficient to deter a nuclear attack. You don't have to have one-for-one numerical parity to deter a potential nuclear adversary, given how powerful nuclear weapons are. So that's my perception based upon our conversations with Chinese officials and experts. That said, China needs to be part of the nuclear disarmament enterprise. They too have a responsibility under Article 6 of the NPT, and they cannot indefinitely, stand outside of the conversations about nuclear risk reduction, arms control, and eventually disarmament.
Professor Kazi, China has used its no first use doctrine to counter any initiative for China to indulge in arms control, nuclear arms control, and nuclear proliferation. Having said that, China's no first use doctrine has evolved over a period of time. And it is becoming much more broad and less restrictive as it was initiated earlier. Do you have any comments on that?
That's a great observation. And yes, there are concerns in Southern Asia regarding China's posture. In any case, the way China is aggressively modernizing its nuclear arsenal. I mean, I agree with Dr. Kimball that China is not seeking parity, but at the same time, China is very much into horizontal proliferation. Vertical proliferation. And given so, that definitely has a domino effect in Southern Asia. Of course, India has maintained, India is not involved in any aggressive arms race vis-a-vis China, but we also need to factor that given China's aggressive vertical proliferation and the kind of camaraderie that China shares with Pakistan, having two nuclear neighbors on the northern side and the western side, it is not a very pleasant or a comfortable situation as far as India is concerned. And it has its own implications as far as non-proliferation goals are concerned. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Professor Kazi. My next question goes to Sanjana. Sanjana, Professor Kazi, while talking about China's vertical proliferation, by a slip of tongue, used the word horizontal proliferation. But that is actually true. China has proliferated not only vertically and continues to do, it is the only P5 and N5 states that has indulged in horizontal proliferation and has transferred fissile material to different countries, specifically Pakistan, and technology for generating further fissile material to some of the so-called rogue nations. Any comments on that?
Yes, that's very true. We've always known about the China-Pakistan nuclear nexus, and it's nothing new. It started in the 1970s, gained momentum in the 1980s. Pakistan would not have been able to build its bomb without the Chinese help. So the Chinese gave them the material, they gave them the design. So they had the recipe and the ingredients. All they had to do is just make the bomb. And the initial test, Pakistan scientists have always been part of, they visited China. It's also argued that the first test actually happened at Lochner in China. So that was in the 80s. But we've seen answers of missiles in the 90s. Very recently, Pakistan believes that it can lease submarines because India has deployed submarines now. So Pakistan really relies on China, and China has always given Pakistan the support. So the proliferation nexus, it's been around since the 70s, and it's still around, and it's a cause of concern for India and for the world at large.
Do you want to say anything about leakage of fissile material from quote unquote joint Pakistan-China sponsorship to non-state actors? We have not talked about non-state actors.
So I know that this Chashma reactor that China has built, helped Pakistan build. It's not under the safeguard of the IAEA. I'm not sure about the leakage of the material. These are not, we don't have data openly available on that, and I really don't know much about it. So I cannot comment on that. But China has helped Pakistan build reactors. So that's, and we don't know how China is going to enrich uranium and how it's going to siphon it towards making warheads. It's all under the carpet, but it's very concerning.
Daryl, as Executive Director of Arms Control Association, does your organization have any data on leakage of fissile material to non-state actors for creation of so-called dirty bomb?
Well, we have done a lot of work on nuclear material security over the years, and there's been a rather robust effort involving many nations in a cooperative fashion to minimize the stockpiles of nuclear materials that could be used in dirty bombs, or especially for nuclear weapons. It's an ongoing challenge. There were 4 nuclear security summits beginning in 2010-11. Those no longer go on. Now there's more focus through the IAEA on these issues. But I think the main problem with respect to dirty bombs, which are not, it's not an explosion created by a chain reaction, but it is a chemical explosive involving nuclear material that spreads radioactive material. That is primarily a problem that involves industrial and medical nuclear materials that are widespread all around the world. And it's a challenge for every country that possesses even small quantities. So the risk of a dirty bomb will be there for many years to come. I would just note that I think all of the nuclear weapon possessor states, whether they're in the NPT or not, they have a very strong interest in securing their fissile material stockpiles. Producing HEU and plutonium comes at enormous cost, political, economic, financial. So, I am skeptical that any one of these 9 countries has an interest in sharing even a small amount of their fissile material, or allowing it to be insecure in such a way as there's an insider threat or a terrorist threat. So I think the main problem that we face with respect to nuclear risk is the further buildup of fissile material stockpiles, of nuclear weapons, of nuclear use, of nuclear testing. And coming back to the FMCT itself, how can we move forward on this long-sought nuclear restraint measure that has been on the international agenda for 50, 60 years now. And I think there are some ways in which the United States, China, Pakistan can adjust their positions on negotiating issues at the Conference on Disarmament to move ahead on not just the FMCT, but on other initiatives that would reduce nuclear risk, like legally binding negative security assurances towards non-nuclear weapon states, as well as the FMCT.
Professor Sato, we know that the process at CD is very slow because it works by consensus. And that creates an impediment that out of 65 countries, if one puts a roadblock, you cannot have the treaty negotiated. In your opinion, would it be prudent to remove the venue of FMCT from CD to some different forum?
I think this multilateral efforts by consensus at the CD and the bilateral negotiations to address the particular country's nuclear development will likely go hand in hand. And in regard to, I think, Iran, the European and Americans, the distance on the issue has tremendously narrowed since Biden came to power, but it hasn't really materialized to the extent that the re-engagement of Iran is realistic. But I think North Korea's case is even more pessimistic, and that's because North Korea, we experimented with bilateral and it didn't work. And that's why six-party talks was launched in the first place. But then the Trump, well, even before Trump, six-party talk was dead, and the kind of new bilateral approach the U.S. brought in under Donald Trump was even over much lower quality as a negotiation approach, and it was very much a political show and not enough substance in it. So the U.S. allies and friends in the region, both South Korea and Japan, and others who paid up in the first multilateral attempt to disarm North Korea, including Australians and New Zealanders who made financial contributions, and also the European Union, who was paying money to help North Korea build light water reactors for power generations. And all of them felt they were not only betrayed by North Korea, but they were betrayed by the U.S. because U.S. simply returned to bilateralism and the showmanship under Donald Trump.
Thank you, Professor Sato. It is true that for a universally acceptable, negotiated, and verifiable FMCT, we cannot rely on bilateral measures or regional measures. It has to be universal. My question again to Daryl is, should we change the venue from CD to some other forum?
That's a good question. It's an obvious question given how long the Conference on Disarmament has failed to move ahead with negotiations. Theoretically, a group of countries could put forward a resolution at the UN General Assembly mandating a negotiation on an FMCT. The resolution could define the scope. They could use the Shannon mandate from the mid-90s again, or something else. And there could be a negotiation conference of a certain length to finalize such an agreement and open it for signature. The problem, I think, with that approach is that those states that have been let's call them the impediments to begin negotiations at the CD would see that as an end around, and they would stand aside. They would not participate in such a negotiation. They would not join such an agreement. So I think it would be likely that if that route were pursued, we would not see Pakistan participate. We would not see China participate or join. They would call it discriminatory. Perhaps India, which made a similar charge about the CTBT when it was negotiated, the CD in 1996, there was a near consensus text. India blocked a final agreement, but because of the overwhelming support of the international community, there was a UNGA resolution that brought the treaty forward for approval and opening for signature. And so ever since, India has, I think, unfortunately stood aside from the CTBT and has not signed it. So I think that would be the result. It would be an unsatisfying result, but it would nevertheless create a legally binding norm against the production of weapons grade HEU and plutonium. But I think the route that needs to be pursued right now is to try to find a way for key states at the CD to rethink and adjust their positions in such a way that is, mutually beneficial to all and is balanced, that allows the negotiation on an FMCT as well as other disarmament initiatives to move forward.
Thank you, Daryl. It's been a pleasure talking to our distinguished panel of experts on roadblocks to CTBT. Clearly, it is a topic that is not of general or common interest. It's an esoteric subject, but it is an important subject if we have to talk about future of humanity. For any such international treaty, I will still bring the issue of non-state actors. Not all the 9 nuclear weapon states are the same. We do know that one of those states did collaborate with Al-Qaeda, and not active duty, but retired nuclear scientists from that country traveled to neighboring Afghanistan, which was under Taliban control at that point in time, and held negotiations with Osama bin Laden for creating nuclear weapons under the rubric of, under the auspices of Al-Qaeda, which is not a nation state. It is on record, it has been talked about. I think time has come for international community not to disregard that and not to continue indulge in a state that has used terrorism of any kind as a state policy. So the bluff of that particular state needs to be called on international fora. Otherwise, you will never have a universally verified FMCT. It has to be done globally, not regionally, not bilaterally, and unless the 2 major nuclear powers come to some sort of understanding that a bluff has to be called, we will not have a FMCT. So my thanks to Daryl Kimball, Sanjana Gogna, Yoichiro Sato, and Reshmi Kazi for taking out 1.5 hours of their valuable time on a Saturday, especially Professor Sato at 11 p.m. I don't know what's the time now. It's probably no longer Saturday. But thank you very much indeed. Thank you to our audience. Again, it's not a very popular subject. It's only talked about in academic circles. And my sincere thanks to Team CSA that helps me organize such programs. We will be ending this program formally now. Just a piece of information, CSA will have a distinguished lecture on Saturday, April 20th, 10 a.m. Eastern Daytime by Ambassador Harshvardhan Shringla. So I will invite our audience to join for that particular lecture. This program has been live streamed simultaneously on our YouTube channel. A video recording would be available for perpetuity on our website as well as on our YouTube channel. Thank you very much indeed for participating in this program.
Thank you.